Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final subtopic on which to some of you may be the last or second last or third from last topic, I suppose, in the course, environmental stressors. This is 15.4, being too hot or too cold. Okay, so hot and cold stress, a reality for us every day, one or the other generally, and in a lot of workplaces. Okay, so humans and air temperature, and again, I apologize, I only listed things in Fahrenheit here for this class, but you can do the conversions if you care to. So 72 degrees is your general rule of thumb across the board. Humans are happy, are comfortable at that climate. And then things get a little bit warmer and we're still okay up to a certain point. And then we have danger zone and potentially, we're looking at playing, the World Cup in Qatar, where 140 degrees Fahrenheit is potentially, I don't know, that's possible, maybe. So, and anywhere, we could see this, or, any environment, not just outdoors. Conversely, we also could have colder climates. In fact, this describes much of my life prior to becoming a Texan. I lived in colder climates. I dealt with every winter, clothing, not letting my face freeze. That was real stuff. And there's a lot of work that needs to get done outside in very hot and very cold climates. That means human workers are dealing with this, and that means, just like for any human activity when exposed to the elements, there are safety concerns and, and considerations. All right, so this looks probably familiar from the previous subtopic on thermoregulation and the different heat exchange mechanisms. Again, one thing I like to ask about and make sure people recognize is evaporation is the only energy transformation here, the only energy conversion, sorry, the only energy transfer that is removing heat energy from the body exclusively. It cannot also add heat energy like all of these other guys. I guess metabolic heat doesn't, well, yeah, that's the kind of your starting point. But yes, evaporation, right? That's a good one. Okay, so if we are too hot, if we are above 0 for delta H, over time, what does this mean? So, we've all experienced this, being, in a state where we're uncomfortably warm. And not only is this physically affecting us, but cognitively. And so, information processing becomes less than ideal. It's a bad sort of context with which to take exams, to be in school. So there's a lot of extra regulations about, hey, this is the environment where, learning is supposed to happen and information processing needs to be encouraged. We need air to be relatively cool and, ventilated and all that. Perceptual motor tasks also can be affected in, hyperthermic conditions, hyperthermia. Tracking psychomotor tasks like, what do I perceive, and then immediately how do I react to it? Feed like closed loop sorts of feedback motor tasks, for example. And reaction time tasks are also affected by heat. Long term, not well known. You can have a hot weekend and it's not well known how that's going to affect your health for the rest of your life. Mixed reviews, so I can't make a conclusion on that. But if you have a severe, like, medical condition sort of circumstance, you're, really in extreme danger, for your life. And, all of the physiological functions that depend on body, internal state being at a certain temperature and, energy levels being, at a state for supporting metabolic processes and fluid levels being there and all that. So yes, these can be, really problematic if you have a severe heat circumstance. Okay, which human factors are at play here, or which, I guess system factors? Not just temperature, but humidity. And we're going to talk about some thermal indices that are more than just what's the air temperature outside that matter for things like what's my risk of hyperthermia. Air velocity matters. If there's any sort of breeze, we know this in Texas, if there's any sort of breeze, it is a huge relief. Faster air movement, more conduction, so it's a cooling effect, just like when we had, the billowing clothing that's worn in really hot desert climates, for example, to circulate air across the surface of the body. Individual differences: when people are more physically fit and healthier, they are better at adapting to extreme temperature conditions. They have more tolerance for hot and more tolerance for cold. So, being physically fit is going to help you in this case as well. Young people are better than older people, but that's just because younger people are generally also more physically fit. Just put, for the same reasons. No differences. I'm sorry, this is incorrect. So there is one with hypo. Excuse me. So, but males are apparently less susceptible to hyperthermia effects than females. I don't recall the citation for that. So right now I'm saying this, and it must be true because it's in the notes, but it might be worth looking into a little bit. And for certain, hyperthermia, if this is about heat transfer at the surface of the body, if you have a larger mass to surface area ratio, then there's less loss of heat energy with time. So when people have a heavier body type, more insulation and more mass to be cooled, there's less heat transfer, for that cooling process also. Okay, so clothing, that we can encourage here to, for dealing with hyperthermia. Sorry, the sweat wicking clothing, and so think about working in environments where, it's really, you're outside, and therefore it just should be just about, thermal regulation first, and then how you look second. But these types of clothing work well with the sweat mechanism to help the body cool. Acclimation, I've got a few slides coming here where we'll talk about how humans acclimate to different climates. It adjust to a warmer or cooler climate in terms of how their body reacts to heat changes. And so if you're working, where there's air conditioning everywhere you go, then, it may be hard to come up with a full adjustment. For me, when I moved from Michigan to Texas, took about a year, I think, or at least a full summer, for me to be able to bear the heat of Texas. And I think a lot of that had to do with my body physiologically adapting and becoming sweatier. And I'll talk more about that when with the slide. Exposure to less heat is better. Obviously, exposure to less heat is better, and taking breaks is important. I have mascots here because I couldn't find a good picture of what I know has happened, and I've had friends who have served as mascots in these sorts of costumes, and how hot they can be inside, and how, to do your job, you are inside essentially one of these in the sun, and how bad that can be, and how essential it can be to have breaks where you can remove some of that heat enclosing. It won't let it escape, sort of effectively clothing around you. Okay, so I mentioned already that there are a number of ways to measure the thermal properties of the environment, and we have our standard air temperature, so what we see on the bank sign. And yes, unfortunately, 109 degrees Fahrenheit is not impossible, and not even implausible in this summer 2022 here in Texas, at least. But what we call this, to distinguish it from the other types of instruments we're going to reference, is the dry bulb temperature. So the normal air temperature does not consider humidity, does not consider moving air, just what's coming into contact with the bulb when it's, I guess, dry because it's shielded and, not exposed to air. Then we have more advanced indices, and these are going to be the ones, that we think about for, all right, yeah, it's hot outside. but how hot is it relative to the human, who is the human worker, and I have to make safety related decisions, the human sports player, and I have to make player safety decisions. And so I'll show you some data here that come from the American Society of Medical Sports Medicine, something like that. We'll see it when it comes up here. But this is where we get things like this feels like indicator that's different from the overall air temperature outside. And so this factors in those other aspects that work with how human thermal regulation functions. So the main index, there are a number of these, but the main one that I want you to think about, and we're going to break it down, is this wet bulb globe temperature, WBGT. And what this does is it takes into account air temperature, but it also, in a weighted sense, considers humidity factors. It considers movement of air. It considers radiant energy. Am I in direct line of sight of a fire or the sun, or is it overcast day or whatever? So wet bulb globe temperature, that's our universal index for things like human safety in, hot environments. There's also something called the heat stress index, which is developed by the National Weather Service. This is for, primarily safety related reasons, but this also has geographic differences. And then similarly, for when it's too cold, we have our wind chill index. Each of these, the HSI and the wind chill index, are managed or routinely I don't know about routinely, but occasionally updated by the US National Weather Service. So there's some science behind defining each of those and refining them with time, when we know these relationships between the elements and what that ultimately does to a human. All right, so here's our big, special thermal index. Definitely something that you're going to want to be familiar with, and the little tiny details that go with this. So for things like any assessments for this topic or any final exams that might happen in this course. So our wet bulb globe temperature, first of all, our default equation, and here it is, when we are outside in the sun or when we're in the presence of radiant energy sources. The sun is a radiant energy source, but also, maybe I'm in a foundry and I've got, several radiant energy furnaces, for example. So it doesn't need to be the sun. There are other ways, that heat energy radiant, that there's a radiant source. So assuming we have that, then this is the full equation. And the key here is I'll break down each of these, but we have the wet bulb globe temperature, WBGT, that's the full guy. Natural wet bulb temperature, and I'll show you what that means. The dry bulb temperature, that's what we saw on the bank sign. That's the most basic type, dry bulb temperature. And the globe temperature considers radiative sources. So I'll show you each of those shortly. But if we are not in the presence of radiant energy, our globe temperature is no longer something that we want to think about. Then we take the remaining, 20% there, and we lump it in with the dry bulb temperature, which, little foreshadowing, would be the same thing. You could actually use this same equation indoors, and effectively, if you don't have additional energy from radiance like the sun, then the globe temperature and the dry bulb temperature are identical. So globe temperature only is higher than the dry bulb temperature if there's a sun present, if there's a radiant energy source present. So yeah, so inside, this could be a hot place too, no sun, okay. But what do these other instruments on the wall tell me about the climate in here, as far as how bearable is this, how safe is it for my humans? All right, so these are a couple of, old-timey, and then this is a digital representation here. But if you have a sophisticated, safety-based thermometer setup, again, maybe there will be some sort of, problem on assessments or exams where the story basically works in, the fact that we have these sorts of different thermometers, and what do they mean? All right, so the first two most basic ones are dry bulb. That's this one here. We've all seen them. We've all maybe not all of us, but most of us have stuck them in our mouths at some point, you know, to take our internal body temperature. The dry bulb is shielded from radiation and moisture. It's not affected by those. So whatever's going on with the mercury reserve in there, you know, it's not affected by those features. Natural wet bulb. Now I have to take a, you know, well, first this, then this, just 1-2 steps here. So I've got italicized to help us walk us through this. So what we see here, I think, is what we call a wet bulb temperature probe. And that's because if you pour water in here, assume there's water in here, this will always be wet, then this will always be wet. And if you have the main temperature kind of probe element always wet, then you can directly compare, or you'll see a comparative difference in the cooling effects from evaporation, you know, that are on the wet wick. Okay, so typically what we see here is the wet wick, the wet bulb thermometer here. Here we go, wet cloth wick is going to be less than the dry bulb, and that accounts for the difference of the cooling effect of evaporation. So the air temperature is the same between these two. The only difference is this one is wet, therefore it has the ability to have evaporative heat loss, basically, from that probe there. All right, so but there's a difference between one of these in just like a still context, it's just always wet, and one where there's moving air to then really facilitate, I guess, a normal rate of evaporation. So they define the rate of normal evaporative air, I think is 2.5. Yes, here we go. So 2.5 meters per second. If the air if we have enough moving air to be 2.5 meters per second, again, I'm not exactly sure what that means in terms of like what are fan speeds. But the wet bulb temperature, then that's enough to say we've got you know, a full evaporative aspect here. And so our natural wet bulb temperature, so again, the N here, the italicized part, the natural wet bulb temperature equals wet bulb temperature if we have enough air movement to say, okay, yeah, that's representative of evaporation in the general world. So, you know, I think part of this is that we've got, you know, these items enclosed in like protected structures. So there needs to be both of those, both wetness and moving air. And so I think there's, you know, this slight conversion here. So if there's still air, then here is our approximation. So our natural wet bulb temperature, 0.9 times the wet bulb temp plus 0.1 times the dry bulb temperature. And so what this is effectively doing is saying, if the air is still, then we have a relatively higher natural wet bulb temperature because we have a relatively, you know, we're approximating a little bit of the dry bulb temp that's always higher than the wet bulb temperature. Okay, it's always at least as high, if not higher, than the dry bulb temp. All right, so there you go. So again, there's several abbreviations, things here. I want to talk about wet bulb globe temperature. That is going to ask for the natural wet bulb temp, and recognize that there's a little bit more to it than just what we see in this temperature gauge here. It also matters if there's moving air or not. If there's not moving air, it's not natural wet bulb temp. We assume a certain amount of circulation. All right, there we go. All right, last instrument in this global W blah 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 wet bulb globe temp, right? So the last one is our globe thermometer to collect the globe temperature. This is essentially, think of this as a regular thermometer, and the probe is in the middle of this black rubber ball, and this black rubber ball then absorbs the energy that might be radiant and re-radiates it into the interior of the ball, and that would add heat on top of the air temperature. So globe temperature is always going to be at least as much as the dry bulb temperature, and potentially higher if there's additionally radiant energy sources like direct sunlight or, you know, fire or whatever. So there's always a black ball, and that's why, because it's a absorb and re-radiate material into the interior. All right, so again, you know, those, let me go back to the equation one more time. There it is. If we've got a radiant source, we consider that globe temperature, the GT here. If there isn't a radiant source, then that 0.2 of the GT is absorbed by the dry bulb temperature. So there's always 70% natural wet bulb temp, 30% other ones. But again, know this one, there's a very high probability of it coming up on assessments, final exams, etc. All right. Okay, there we go. So why does it matter here? So we've just, you know, we can calculate these wet bulb globe temperatures. It's an index, you know, it would be expressed, I suppose, in, I guess, degrees Fahrenheit, WBGT degrees Fahrenheit. These are the ranges, you know, for outdoor activities that are considered by the American College of Sports Medicine. So they published these. And so, yeah, if we are, you know, in the pushing 80, pushing, you know, 85, 86 degrees, and this is continuous activities like, you know, sprints, you know, we're doing things outside, athletic activities, doing hard labor outside. You know, there's a significant health risk here, both in the immediate and long-term, you know, sort of risks there. So, you know, these doctors say don't do it, at least in terms of sports. And they've differentiated continuous from intermittent activities. So most things we do outside in hot weather are probably considered intermittent. So even, you know, sports or not, you know, going outside and doing any sort of work in an outdoor climate, we have to consider, you know, these limits as well. It matters if you've been acclimatized or not, you know, so have you had time to adjust to a different, you know, thermal environment, or are you relatively shocked into this, you know, into this very unfamiliar hot or cold context? I guess in this case we're talking hot. But yeah, there you go. All right, our heat stress index, I mentioned this is defined and refined by the National Weather Service. What we see here is, here's the equation. I'm not going to ever ask you to do this equation. I'm just showing you where it comes from because it's a percentile. But the way you think of it is, you know, 100% is considered to be like what's required is the maximum heat energy. So the maximum cooling rate that could be possibly achieved by sweating must be achieved in order to maintain, you know, this work level. And of course, I can be higher than this, but it's a nice, convenient point to say, okay, well, 100% means the fittest person, their reasonable physiological output of sweat, which is our most effective cooling mechanism, our most effective thermal regulation in terms of cooling is the evaporative properties of sweating. So anyway, our cooling rate can be defined empirically. You know, the young, fit, you know, what is it, probably 20-year-old male, you know, army recruit or something, you know, might be defined by this sweating profile. But yeah, so the equation is here. I'm not, you know, I'm just showing you for background. I'm not exactly the vapor point of water on skin. I'm not interested in that. But the numbers here, what it matters, 100% is supposed to be the limit of safe, you know, really the extreme high limit. You know, 70 to 90%, you're already in a dangerous spot here. You know, 40 to 60%, this probably wouldn't be too uncommon. You'll see in the you know, table on the next page how this breaks down. You and I have probably mowed our lawn or done some sort of outdoor activity, you know, in the 60%, you know, range here. And then, of course, you can go down to there's no problem at all, and even it's actually too cold, which is a weird thing, but just to show that mathematically it does, you know, I guess it does. Yes, it does. You can have negative numbers. All right, so this is kind of what that might look like. So let's see, today, I think I saw 103 today. And I don't know what the relative humidity outside is. I'm going to assume fairly low because College Station is not had a lot of rain lately, so we're likely 110, 100 and something around this range. If it's assuming humidity is lower than 40, I don't know. But yeah, maybe this heat index here says, okay, well, a young, healthy, fit, ideal sort of person doing outdoor work is already over their limit in this sort of temperature. So there isn't a legally binding way to say, okay, well, you're over your limit, what that. But this is all, recommended, and to some extent there may be medical oversight for certain activities, but there's no legal thing that says you can't work in 110 degrees. It's just really ill-advised and unsafe and unhealthy. There you go. All right, so there we go. So if we are too hot, what can we do? What can we do with the system around us? Choose clothing that is going to be effective for the task. Remember, radiant heat, one of the easiest ones to manage because you can use reflective material. And so, even these suits don't even necessarily need to be that much insulated as much as they just need to be blocking that radiant energy, if that's the primary, source here. You can redesign a job so that metabolic heat is used more effectively, or used, or basically less of it is required, or less of it is produced. If there are hot things people are working around, move those things. They're then conductive and convective energy, radiant energy from hot machines. Use air conditioning, use fans. This obvious, we all know this. Keep in mind that air conditioning is not just cooler air, it also dehumidifies the air. That makes sweating and evaporation more effective also. When there's drier air, there is more effective absorption of the sweat from the body. So, we have evaporation cooling more effectively. Make sure everybody's got enough liquids. So, make sure you're stay hydrated, right, and opportunities. So actually, I remember when I was growing up, I never played in sports like this, but I read stories about where, in the South, for example, there would be extreme, sports practices, football, soccer, whatever, in the heat, and kids would get dehydrated, and there would be sort of a culture of toughness that would say, oh, I don't need to drink water, I'm good to keep going, coach, or whatever. And then some kids died, and I think it hasn't been resolved fully, but there was a clear cultural shift where there started to be mandated water breaks, at any sort of organized sport, for example, and I hope in professional settings as well. I don't know as much there, but things like, no, you're required to have, and I see this with my kids and their sports events. There's a required stop and have everybody water breaks, when not normally those would be there, I suppose. So yeah, stay hydrated, especially. It's our most effective way of thermal regulation is sweating, and it only works if we have the fluids that we need. All right, so we've just spent so much time in Texas being hot. Isn't this nice? So we can also be in too cold environments. Again, as I mentioned, I lived a lot of my life in contexts like this. It is, let's see, it's August 1st here, 2022, 103 degrees outside today. I'll say it on camera, on recording. I would trade 100 times, maybe now 99 times out of 100, the summers in Texas. I'd take those over the winters of Michigan 99 times out of 100. One time out of 100, I'd say, all right, I need to ice out maybe this summer. But no, I think it's much more bearable to be too hot than it is to be too cold. That's me personally. Hopefully no humans have to deal with the extreme sides of those, we at least we address this as much as we can. All right, so if we are too cold, this also, just like with too hot, so hypothermia and hyperthermia are both at play here. Both of them make us less than ideal information problem solvers. Okay, so we are, our coordinated, motion, our activities, if we're really cold, and part of that is because we're distracted by how cold we are. There's also a distribution of blood thing that doesn't leave a whole lot of, oxygenated blood for cognitive work. It's a little bit more on the surface of the skin. Right. Okay. So in the short-term sense, long-term effects. So I guess this is more of a sort of a short term that affects you long-term. Frostbite. This is a real threat. I lived with it growing up. I had to wear mittens to school to avoid frostbite. And there are cases where I certainly probably would have had frostbite without my mom saying you have to wear these things. Hypothermia. This is life-threatening. Again, just like with way too hot, this is, no joke for work environments, for everyday life. Too hot and too cold are more than just uncomfortable, they're dangerous, right? All right, easiest thing that we can do to avoid being too cold is layer. So just like with sweating being the most effective way for us to shed heat, the most effective way for us to maintain heat is insulation. And clothing is our best form of insulation. Even, technology enhanced clothing can be even more effective. Basically, we're trapping air around our body so that less and less, it's essentially causing an insulating layer of air to maintain that heat, in and around our bodies here. So exposure, to other temperatures means a heat transfer. If I am wrapped up in more insulating layers and there's less surface area exposed to different temperatures, I'm maintaining more heat internally. There's less heat exchanged. All right. Now, keep in mind in these work contexts that more layers, safety or not, will affect potentially your ability to physically interact in those environments. And so things like gloves and work gloves, being part of a major, a lot of environments that are outdoors in colder climates, this is going to affect how well people can do their jobs, how well they interface with tools, how well they feel various controls. If you remember, the topic on controls, in which there was a control confusion case, that I worked on. It's about wearing gloves and haptic and tactile, sorts of feedback that might matter for the sorts of tasks at hand. If you're cold, you're wearing protective equipment. This is going to limit your dexterity and kind of what you can do physically in that environment. All right, so this is I didn't get a real picture of frostbite, but you can Google it if you're a masochist, I suppose. But this is not an exaggerated image, even though it's cartoon here, because when we get frostbite, we actually have a freezing. So water crystallizes and becomes ice at a certain temperature. There is a lot of water in our tissues, and when we have the thinner parts, the less heat managed parts of our body, because they're way out at the periphery here, like our fingertips, our ears, our extremities, our parts of our face, when that high water content tissue then gets down to a certain level, a certain temperature, it will freeze like any other water. And so then what you have here is tissue damage, because the restructuring molecularly of water for ice is it becomes crystalline. And so you have a change in the structure of the tissue, or basically what was water becomes then ice cubes. I mean, you can think of it that way, at least, at a microscopic level. And it causes some pretty severe tissue damage, or it can. Imagine all, kind of shredding all of the small capillaries and tissues in our peripheries here. And so especially our farthest away from our heat chambers, our internal, our guts here and our torso, but furthest away, and I always talk about my fingertips, those being, the last guys to get the heat and the blood circulation from the heart. Because of the furthest away. They're also the most radiant. If I have no gloves in a cold environment, I'm losing heat on all of this surface area here. And very quickly, we can have our extremities can get really, really cold and can potentially freeze. And this is the consequence, right? So what happens? We have freezing. We have that shredding of the tissue at the microscopic level. It's not necessary. I mean, it could be just kind of like you got you got a lot of carnage here, but there's recovery possible. So what happens is, you don't want to just like break up the break up the ice and shake it out. No, this you want to bring the tissue back, slowly. And so if somebody has frostbite, you want to start, submerge the affected body part in close to room temperature water, bring it up slowly. Okay, so like a warm water, bring it up slowly. And bringing up that temperature slowly means there isn't an abrupt, change from crystalline, melting, whatever, and causing more tissue damage, I suppose. So yes, very tender, very damaged tissue, get medical attention quickly, and be gentle in the warming. All right, here we go. Wind chill index. I mentioned, as the other National Weather Service provided, index here. So I don't have the specifics exactly of this equation, but the main message here is it doesn't really consider humidity so much as wind. And so when things are cold and you combine that with moving air, we have the convective cooling effects, right? So we are, I go outside, all of the heat energy of my body is sucked out by the air immediately around me. And if that air is moving, then there's more fresh, cold air immediately against my skin to then, to be reabsorbed. So add wind and cold feels colder, or effectively, or what it means is it's more effective at cooling with moving air, right? Good. So again, I won't make you know any equation because I don't know it, but add wind, colder. And here's the chart that you may need to work with. You may need to consider this for assessments, final exams, etc. Where I might tell you, for example, that, okay, I've been exposed outside for 90 minutes to, let's see, oh, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, I might say 90 minutes. It's, let's say, 0 degrees and it's 30 miles per hour wind. So I go, okay, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and here's 30 miles per hour wind, and it's right there. And okay, if I've been outside for 90 minutes, and oh, this says I'm only good for 30 minutes before I have frostbite warning. That's what this comes from, right? 30 minutes. I'm in the slightly more blue region. And so what does that mean? Well, I better wear gloves. Frostbite risk here. 30 minutes for exposed skin. Okay. So better have a hat, better probably have a scarf too, if I'm outside for 90 minutes there. And you can see, if I go to the Antarctic, if I go to colder and colder temperatures, it gets more and more, I've got 5 minutes of exposed skin before I have frozen tissue. I have frostbite, there you go. Oh, there is the equation. You don't have to know that, but there it is. All right. Okay, so when humans are exposed to the elements or whatever, their body temperature is, lower than about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. We call this hypothermia, emergency hypothermia. It's a medical emergency. What you may see is people unable to stop shivering. No matter what they do, they can't stop shivering. They're starting to show, they're somewhat delirious. They're not making full amount of sense. They're really tired, unexpectedly tired. There may be a paleness, a cool bluish tint, to the skin, at least relative to their normal, red flushed, oxygenated, warm-blooded selves. Yes, it may appear like somebody is intoxicated. So if they're, slurring speech, for example, doing things that are affected their coordination, this could be because their body level, body temperature is so low, it's affecting their motor control. If this is, recognized, first call 911, get the medical emergency underway, warm people up, but do it in a, gentle way. Don't just put them in a hot shower. Warm bottles of water are very nice because they kind of maximize the surface area. And then if they're warm, obviously their conductive heat transfer there. Some of the key body regions to warm based on keeping the torso and head are critical aspects, but then also kind of the regions where some of the most heat loss could happen based on the circulation patterns there. So the armpits, the groin, the neck, and the head, about these regions here. And so there are things like, yes, hypothermia, emergency, recovery sorts of wraps. And it's not a coincidence that this man is not wearing clothes. This is about, regenerating and maintaining heat in a really protected sort of context there. Recirculating. Okay, factors here. The wind chill, just talked about that. Humidity, like I mentioned, doesn't affect wind chill humidity, but when it's drier out, you have more skin irritation with the moving cold air. Okay, so things, mucous membranes can be insulating to some extent, right? So again, like I mentioned, if we're relatively fitter, we are better at handling really hot, and we're better at handling really cold. The age younger is going to be better at handling extremes than older people. I can attest to that. The older I get, the less tolerant I suppose I am, of the extreme weather. No difference for sex here. So I stumbled a little bit when I said hyperthermia. There is a difference. Males are more resistant to hyperthermia than females. This does not seem to be a difference for hypothermia. Men and women, males and females are both susceptible to an equivalent amount. And then here, if it's about maintaining heat, body mass versus surface area, and relatively smaller heat transfer based on how much is stored in the body, more heavier people are going to have more mass. They're going to have a slower dissipation of their core temperature. All right. Okay, other factors here, the situation at hand, the jobs, clothing. This is not, I don't think, a work environment, but the areas, again, that are most important to keep relatively warm in cold climates are the ones that are covered by a winter coat. Your torso and your head, I guess your arms too. But torso and head, most important. Everything else will get heat if those two, body segments are well taken care of. We can get adjusted to cold temperature just like we can for hot temperature. It can take several weeks. And effectively what happens, I thought I had some slides on this, but I missed them. When we are, I should say, going from cold to hot climates, we have an increase in sweat content. That definitely happened to me. I became a sweatier person when I moved from Michigan to Texas. But I've also seen, kind of the reverse, where now when I go to, I go back north to visit family or something in northern colder climates, and the cold feels harsher to me. And I guess I'm not, my sweat patterns aren't there, but there is a certain internalized comfort level and temperature that gets shifted when you're in hotter or colder climates. Right, great, okay. So this is self-explanatory. Less time in the cold is better. Pace yourself if you're working in an environment that requires exposure to the cold. So here's an interesting measure here. We actually can quantify the insulating properties of a certain, clothing outfit. And so this, matters for things like, well, here's our work attire. This is the required outfit, or this is a functional outfit for this workplace. And it might be about managing one's thermal regulation to get the most out of the human worker, right? So the CLO is our unit of measure. And basically, if a windowless room, no moving air, somebody is sitting there, resting person, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and they're comfortable, then we say that is 1 clo of unit of clothing. And so we have fractions of clo that you can see here. Frequently women are, women's fashions in the United States and the Western world are typically less insulating than men's, clothing choices or clothing, general office attire even. But you can see this is, a good idea to bring sweaters, if you're in an office environment and there's a range of temperatures you may endure, because it can make a big difference in how much insulation capability you have with your clothing, right? So yeah, here this guy's about 1 clo insulated, right? And yep, just a couple more examples here, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8 closed. All right. So wrapping it up here then, 15.4, hot and cold environmental stressors. So this is a reality for a lot of different environments, a lot of different industries, a lot of different jobs. To consider the too hot and the too cold. In at least the too hot, you're going to want to make sure people are well hydrated, keep the workers safe by providing them fluids, block line of sight from radiant heat sources that are unnecessary. Protective clothing can do quite a bit. Help people, limit their exposure to these environments with rests, with rotations. Don't have somebody working out in the sun for 8 hours at a time without, rotating, to relatively cooler, low metabolic, sorts of tasks. And then keep in mind that people can get used to and can acclimatize, to different environments. If you're going somewhere to work for a long period of time in hotter or colder weather, take the time and help the workers adjust so that they become physiologically more efficient, in those contexts with the, a week or two, I guess at most, of transition. All right, that's it, everybody. Thank you.